the sinews of war are infinite money, and money really is going to talk in this conflict. And so for Ukraine, it's relied so heavily on external support. Any drying up of support is a problem, let alone loss of support from its major donor or delays to that support. And currently, even the perception that there might be no support incoming, you have to imagine the effect that would have on you in terms of morale.
$110 billion is a lot of money. That's how much America has approved in military and economic aid to Ukraine since Russia invaded. Some people put the figure as high as 200 billion, in fact. And is the money going to stop? The Senate is expected to vote on a bill today, which includes $60 billion, more military assistance for Ukraine. But former President Trump has added his voice to the bill's opponents, and it looks unlikely that it can pass. Many Republicans have lost patience with the huge bills attached to a long, grinding war in Ukraine. I've been speaking to Justin Logan, the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the right-wing Cato Institute. He's been telling us that changes in the Republican Party meant there's no longer support for endless provision of funds to Ukraine.
One thing that I would point out on the Republican side of the aisle is the real generational split. So if you think of the people who would be gung-ho for an infinite amount of aid for Ukraine in perpetuity, Liz Cheney is no longer in office. Mitt Romney is retiring. And if you think about the people who are the real critics of this policy, the J.D. Vances, the Josh Hawleys, it's a younger generation of Republican policymakers. And there is really a sense that the battle lines in Ukraine having moved basically not at all in 2023. And with the United States having committed, and I think this is underappreciated, close to $200 billion already, the American people increasingly are saying, what's the end state here? And the Biden administration continues to stick to as long as it takes, whatever it takes. And I think it's a cautionary tale for the notional future Ukraine.
The other factor in all of this is, of course, the most likely next leader of the Republicans again, Donald Trump. He's been fairly clear on this point for a while. If he attains office, he is not going to want to fund indefinitely a war in Ukraine. Can we be confident of that? He seems fairly unequivocal on the subject.
I hesitate to say anything confidently as regards Donald John Trump. But I think that, he has relied heretofore on this sort of magical formula that none of this ever would have happened had I been president, which is not provable or falsifiable in any meaningful way. It could be a case of the dog catching the car. It's running gaily along after the car, but then the car stops and the dog thinks to itself, my goodness, what do I do with this car now? And so I think Trump may be in that similar state where, oh my goodness, now you actually have to deal with this. With Trump, I think it's whatever he has for breakfast that morning or what, there's a lot of, he said we were going to withdraw from Syria. We're still in Syria, so I could, do a half dozen more of those.
Tucker Carlson speaking to Vladimir Putin. We've not seen the interview. He's just done the sort of trailer. Does that mean anything? I wonder whether that means a certain amount of reflection on that Republican viewpoint that Putin is not beyond the pale. Putin is a leader that you have to deal with. Does it signify that, do you feel?
There's a certain ahistorical sense in my country, right? Peter Arnett did a very famous interview with Osama bin Laden in 1997 for CNN. So this idea that there are foreign nasties that are beyond the pale is a new and ahistorical idea in the American consciousness. A lot of people hate Tucker Carlson. A lot of people really like Tucker Carlson. So this is indicative, again, of this Republican dissent from the idea that American security at stake, that the global order is at stake, that world democracy is at stake in Ukraine. And those are all Biden administration claims, which makes them, of course, less legitimate in the eyes of most Republican voters. And Tucker Carlson is an avatar of that point of view. But secondly, I would bet that Tucker Carlson is going to be somewhat more probing than his enemies think he's going to be. I mean, they think this is going to be this kind of Potemkin interview, disgraceful America bashing. I kind of doubt it. And I think that he probably will ask some tough questions, and not to the satisfaction of the Atlantic Council here in Washington or someone that has very firmly held views about Putin's perfidy. But I think it's not going to tip the balance one way or the other than to send the Washington think tanks into a big frenzy.
That's Justin Logan there. He is a Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the right-wing Cato Institute. His central point is that there is a shift in Republican thinking, at least, that this is a long war not involving American soldiers, and therefore at some point the funding is going to come to an end. And if Donald Trump is president, it may well be then.
Let's also speak now to Justin Crump, who is a military veteran and the chief executive of Sibylline, which is a strategic intelligence company. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
If Ukraine were not to get $60 billion more military assistance, what effect would that have?
This conflict is now a pretty attritional one. As you say, very limited movement in front lines last year, and it's making it something of a slugging match where the side that can stay in this longest and keep dishing out damage to the enemy and keep taking damage itself will eventually triumph, or at the very least be in the strongest possible position during talks or any other phase. So, of course, the sinews of war are infinite money, and money really is going to talk in this conflict. And so for Ukraine, that's relied so heavily on external support, any drying up of support is a problem, let alone loss of support from its major donor or delays to that support. And currently, even the perception that there might be no support incoming, you have to imagine the effect that would have on you in terms of morale. Imagine in the Second World War that US supplies to the UK had stopped completely. You can imagine what the mood in the country would have been in terms of wanting to fight on versus having that resolve. So even the delay is harmful. The lack of that amount of military resources, which affects everything from medical supplies at the battlefield through to fuel, logistics, vehicles, and particularly artillery rounds and munitions, of course, which is getting very hard to fight a war, really does leave Ukraine in an increasingly disadvantageous position.
So does the level of funding then that currently exists, does that suggest that all it does is kind of retain the stalemate, or does it suggest that Russia can match that? What does it, by continuing on the road that we are currently on, for example, the EU and America continuing to fund Ukraine, apart from bolstering morale and from not letting Russia overrun Ukraine, which are both incredibly important, what is it actually doing? What is it achieving right now?
You've hit the heart of things and a lot of the debate that's happened over the last couple of years, which is giving Ukraine enough, as you say, to do just enough is fine. That relied on a very careful calculation, I think, of partly not doing so much that Russia felt severely under threat, and we had escalation. I would say that the mantra of the Biden government on all sorts of fronts has been escalation management, because it's had to be. And I certainly wouldn't wish some of these decisions on any world leader, but I think that's been a big part of it. Not providing too much, not providing weapon systems that could be provocative. And actually, the UK has led the way on that. The first nation to supply main battle tanks, the first nation to supply longer range missiles, for example, which we did, unlike the Americans, who've been slightly more conservative about what they've supplied to Ukraine. And certainly the Ukrainians are very grateful for what they've got from the States, of course, but they all said, actually, if you'd given us a lot more, a lot earlier, we'd have been able to do more with it. Now, the flip side of that is the fact that ultimately it doesn't matter how much equipment you have if you haven't got people to use it, if you're not trained to use it. And so, of course, there was no point in giving, say, 1 million tanks to Ukraine if they couldn't crew them. They were just going to be targets or liabilities. So, I mean, to some extent as well, it's reflected the realities of what the military machine in Ukraine can handle and get to the front lines. But the Ukrainians would say, particularly in ammunition, they'd like an awful lot more artillery ammunition, a lot more artillery rounds to suit the nature of the conflict. So there is this argument we haven't gone far enough with enough early enough to be decisive in this conflict, and that's why we're here. I think, again, hindsight is 2020 on all of this, and it's been difficult to manage, and certainly no one saw the course of events we're in now 2 years ago in terms of actually Ukraine not only surviving but pushing back pretty hard after the initial invasion, and then it going to the phase now perhaps is more familiar to what people might have expected looking at fighting between Russia and Ukraine from 2014 to early 2022. So the big question is now, what message are we sending for the future if it's going to be protracted? And I think that's where this aid bill is so important, because this hint that actually the US is not a reliable partner doesn't just matter to Ukraine, it matters to Eastern Europe, which obviously fears the threat from Russia, and it matters to a lot of the rest of the world as to the decisions they make and take. So much more at stake here than just the Ukrainian front line.
So just finally then, Justin, if and it is a big if funding continues at the current level, how long are we going to stay in this particular situation or stalemate, whatever you want to call it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, stalemate was a word we were all avoiding until November last year, very much, for the Ukrainians avoiding it. And then, of course, the commander of their army said it, and I think got into quite a lot of trouble, and his future may be in question. It's difficult at this point. I think the hope was that sanctions would really have damaged the Russian economy, and they have, but not to the extent hoped. Russia has its allies. It has people that arguably are taking advantage of its position to supply it, to support it, to buy materials at reduced price and keep Russia in the fight. So I think maybe the hope that dragging this out long enough, Russia would collapse is probably looking a bit distant at this point. So I don't see that as an end. And of course, the Russians will want to hang on and see what happens, as so many of the rest of us do, in the US election, which really is pivotal for these sorts of reasons. So for the Russians, it's a waiting game. And obviously that starts to take that urgency, as we've seen, of properly supporting Ukraine out, because it's becoming a waiting game for the Republicans as well.
Well, we shall see what happens post-November. Justin, thank you. That's Justin Crump, military veteran and the chief executive of Sibylline. It's a strategic intelligence company.